A bell rope drops through the rafters of a New England meeting house, and somewhere below it, a hand keeps pulling. Not because the hour has changed, but because the light has. Outside, it is noon in late May. The fields should be bright, the road should be white with dust. Instead, the windows go black, the threshold disappears, and men step into the church carrying candles as if night has arrived hours too early. Chickens climb onto their roosts, cattle turn toward the barns. A full spring day folds shut in the middle. The scene is familiar enough: a church, a road, a farm, a bell. But nothing about the scale of the darkness is easy to explain in ordinary terms. The accepted explanation comes early and with confidence. On May 19, 1780, New England experienced what history now calls the Dark Day. Modern researchers generally attribute it to smoke from enormous forest fires, likely in what is now Ontario, mixed with cloud, fog, and unstable weather. In other words, a natural event, an atmospheric accident, the kind of thing that sounds strange until it is reduced to a diagram of wind and soot. That is the official explanation. It may even be broadly correct. And yet, when the surviving record is read closely, the event does not behave like a simple story about smoke drifting too far south. The darkness did not merely dim the landscape. In many places, it erased it. People could not read large print at midday without candles. Rain left black residue on water. The evening brought something worse. A full moon rose into air so thick that witnesses said they could not see a hand held near the eyes. Not a storm, not an eclipse, not a brief pall, a region-wide collapse of visibility, followed by a second darkness under a full moon. That is where the explanation begins to feel thinner than the event itself. So, the hidden theory is not that something supernatural happened, and not that every scientific conclusion is false. It is something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. The Dark Day may have been a compound atmospheric disaster on a scale early America did not know how to describe. Wildfire smoke, maritime fog, layered cloud, ashfall, shifting wind, and possibly electrical weather interacting over a huge area at once. And once the immediate fear passed, the complexity of the event was not exactly suppressed in the dramatic sense. It was filed, scattered, abstracted, and slowly sealed inside the wrong categories. Curiosity, weather, folklore, local panic. What changed was the explanation. Start with time. The record is unusually consistent on that point. Witnesses describe a normal or nearly normal morning, giving way to deepening gloom after around 9 o'clock. By late morning, candles were necessary. Around 1 o'clock, in many places, the darkness reached its height. Then, in the afternoon, some relief. Then night. And after night should have softened under the full moon, another blackout. That sequence matters. Smoke alone can stain a sky for days. It can redden the sun. It can make noon look bruised. But these accounts describe phases, transitions, layers, and a second act after sundown. That suggests structure, not just quantity. Something in the air was moving in bodies, not in a uniform haze. Witnesses noticed it. They described clouds sliding over one another, a heavy black mass to the west and north, thinner formations below, luminous vapors rising and streaming. They were not using modern meteorology, but they were watching carefully. The record is still there. Then, there is the map. The darkness was not confined to one valley, one harbor, one county. Reports place it across much of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine, with effects stretching south toward New York and New Jersey. Contemporary correspondents describe the darkness reaching as far south as Fishkill. George Washington noticed unusual darkening while in New Jersey. In some districts, the effect was weaker. In others, it was nearly absolute. That unevenness is important. It suggests a moving atmospheric architecture with denser cores and thinner margins. It also tells us something else. Whatever crossed New England that day was large enough to ignore colonial boundaries, but irregular enough to create pockets of terror and pockets of uncertainty. People on the edges saw an uncanny twilight. People near the center saw noon become night. When an event is that wide and that uneven, local explanation fails immediately. Only a regional system fits. Now consider the senses witnesses kept returning to. Not just darkness, smell, taste, texture. People described the odor of a chimney fire, swamp fire, malt house, coal kiln. Rainwater carried a black film. Tubs collected sooty residue. Snow in northern areas reportedly showed dark deposits. One account speaks of burnt leaves floating as scum. Another describes the sun, in the days before, as red from rising to setting, compressed somehow, weak in its rays, brassy in appearance. Silver looked like brass. The moon later appeared blood red when it could be seen at all. These are not decorative details. They are material clues. Smoke was present, ash was present, but so was moisture, so was low cloud. So was the optical distortion that comes from dense particulate matter interacting with humid air and changing wind. The atmosphere was not merely dirty, it was stratified. Public reaction tells us how complete the effect really was. This was not a generation unfamiliar with weather. These were farmers, sailors, teamsters, mill workers, clergy, legislators. They knew fog. They knew thunderheads. They knew eclipses occurred. Yet the darkness broke ordinary behavior. Schools dismissed, work stopped, taverns filled, meeting houses filled faster. In Hartford, legislators considered adjournment because many believed Judgment Day had arrived. Abraham Davenport's reply became famous precisely because it sounded calm inside something profoundly abnormal. Bring candles. In other towns, bells were said to ring, and families gathered under a sky they could no longer interpret. That detail matters less as folklore than as social evidence. A population does not abandon routine at scale because a cloud passes over. It does so when the environment stops making sense. To be fair, the mainstream explanation is not weak. In fact, it is stronger than many mysteries receive. Modern fire scar studies point to a major 1780 fire year in the Algonquin Highlands of Ontario and surrounding regions. Tree rings preserve burn scars. Drought conditions existed. Westerly and northwesterly transport is plausible. Later North American wildfire events have darkened skies over vast distances. We have seen that ourselves. Smoke can travel hundreds of miles. It can turn daylight amber, then brown, then nearly black. A full continent can carry the memory of one burning forest. None of that should be dismissed. But the smoke theory, on its own, still leaves a residue of unanswered structure. It explains soot. It explains smell. It explains a red sun. What it does not fully explain is why the darkness intensified with such apparent timing after morning rain, why some accounts describe low maritime vapor and layered clouds moving in different directions, why the evening darkness under a full moon felt in some places even more impenetrable than the day, and why the event produced such sharp regional gradients. The better explanation is not a rejection of the fire theory. It is an expansion of it. Smoke was the fuel in the air, but the machinery that turned it into a black noon may have been a rare compound system. Smoke mass, advection fog from the coast, heavy cloud cover, damp air pushing particulates downward, and shifting winds compressing multiple layers into an almost light-proof canopy. What matters is that the official explanation became singular, while the event itself appears plural. The witness descriptions of animal behavior are often treated as colorful folklore, but they serve another function. Fowls went to roost. Cocks crowed as if night had come. Frogs and crickets sounded. Night birds called. These reactions imply that ambient light levels dropped not merely to storm-dark conditions, but to something close to evening, or deeper. Human eyes adjust poorly under fear and surprise. Animals do not editorialize. They respond to light, temperature, pressure, and rhythm. Their behavior acts almost like a biological instrument panel scattered across the countryside. When poultry, amphibians, and nocturnal birds all begin reporting the same false time of day, the atmosphere has crossed a threshold. The stone remembers. The body remembers too. The moon is the part of the story that should trouble anyone satisfied with a simple answer. The 19th of May in 1780 was near full moon, yet repeated accounts insist that when darkness returned in the evening, the moon gave little or no useful light. Some witnesses briefly saw it as red. Others could not see it at all. That means whatever remained overhead after sunset was not merely daylight haze made dramatic by contrast. It was optically dense enough to smother lunar brightness. Smoke can do that. Thick cloud can do that. Fog can do that. But again, the implication is a layered and persistent atmospheric mass lasting well beyond the moment of panic at noon. If smoke from distant fires was the source, then the air column over New England had become an archive of transport, condensation, and retention. It had trapped the event and held it there. Then there are the records themselves. Not the legends told later, but the documents filed during and just after the event. Abigail Adams wrote of candles lit in every house. Cotton Tufts described black clouds, foul smell, shifting winds, and sooty deposits. Samuel Williams of Harvard gathered observations from across the region and tried to reason through them. Newspapers debated comets, eclipses, volcanic eruptions, and smoke. Letters crossed between households, legislatures, and learned societies. This is not the pattern of a forgotten day that left no evidence. It is the opposite. There was a burst of documentation. What happened afterward is the more interesting part. The reports did not vanish. They hardened into quotations. They were lifted into anecdote, sermon, poem, patriotic legend, and weather curiosity. The archive survived, but its edges were blunted. Filed away is not the same as erased. Sometimes it is more effective. That is where the language of sealing begins to make sense. There was no dramatic ministerial order shutting iron doors on the truth. The sealing was procedural. One report enclosed in another letter. One diary excerpt preserved in a historical society. One scientific note absorbed into an academy memoir. One legislative incident remembered only through a famous line. Once an event is distributed across private correspondence, local newspapers, clerical writing, and early scientific publications, it becomes harder to see whole. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because institutions preserve by fragmentation. Bureaucracy is often just slow burial with labels attached. Widen the scale, and the pattern repeats. In 1881, wildfire smoke darkened skies far from the source. In 1950, smoke from Alberta turned daylight strange over eastern North America. In the 21st century, cities far from burning forests stood under orange noon and falling ash. Each time, people reached first for metaphors of war, eclipse, apocalypse, contamination. Each time, the scientific account eventually stabilized around smoke transport and atmospheric conditions. And each time, what the public remembered was not the mechanism, but the violation of expectation. The lesson is not that the 1780 event was unique beyond nature. The lesson is that these dark days expose how fragile ordinary explanation becomes when the sky itself changes category. That larger pattern points back to 1780 with a sharper question. If later smoke events were documented with telegraphs, weather bureaus, satellite imagery, air chemistry, and press networks, and still caused confusion, then what exactly could people in 1780 have known in real time? They had no regional instrument grid, no synoptic weather maps, no telegraph, no photographs, no atmospheric science in the modern sense. They were trying to understand a continental-scale event with parish boundaries, horseback correspondence, and the naked eye. Under those conditions, classification lag is inevitable. It is also dangerous, because once a rough explanation appears reasonable enough, institutions stop looking. Not from malice, from fatigue, from cost, from the pressure to close the file and move on. The Revolutionary War forms a quiet backdrop here, and it matters more than it first appears. In 1780, governments were unstable, supplies were thin, roads were poor, and attention was elsewhere. A region-wide atmospheric anomaly unfolding in peacetime might have generated coordinated inquiry, or at least broader record consolidation. In wartime, much of the administrative energy was already consumed. That does not mean the event was deliberately hidden. It means it arrived in a world structurally unable to investigate it properly. Classification, economics, war, distance, paper, weather, and time did the work that conspiracy often gets credit for. The pattern does not disappear. It merely sinks into the paperwork of other urgencies. There is another reason the event remained unresolved in cultural memory even after a plausible cause emerged. The official explanation addresses what entered the air. It does not fully address what the experience did to the people under it. A natural cause does not make a phenomenon feel smaller. If anything, the opposite. The idea that distant forests, wind shifts, wet air, and cloud geometry could combine into a black noon over several colonies is not reassuring. It is a reminder that the sky can still produce events larger than the categories available at the time. In 1780, the explanation that finally won was naturalistic. What it did not erase was the proportion. Whole towns believed the world might be ending because the day had become unreadable. Look again at the language witnesses used: Egyptian darkness, midnight at noon, inky black, brass-colored light. These are not neutral terms. They are the vocabulary of people reaching beyond routine weather, because routine weather had failed them. Historians sometimes smooth such language away as piety or exaggeration, but eyewitness language, when repeated across distance, is itself data. If dozens of observers in separate places use the same impossible comparisons, it is worth asking whether they were all indulging panic or whether the event truly exceeded the local range of known atmospheric behavior. What remains is not just a puzzle of cause. It is a puzzle of threshold. How much darkness exactly does it take before a society stops treating weather as weather? And then there is the final discomfort. The more one studies the dark day, the less it resembles a single mystery solved by a single answer. It begins to look like a case study in how anomalies are domesticated. First feared as divine judgment, then argued over in newspapers, then sampled by early scientists, then reduced to smoke, then preserved as folklore, then revived whenever modern wildfire haze turns noon the wrong color. Each generation inherits the event in a form it can tolerate. The theologians made it moral. The legislators made it exemplary. The scientists made it probable. The popular memory made it quaint. But the original witnesses did not experience it as quaint. They experienced the environment failing in broad daylight. What changed was the explanation. The event did not become smaller. The archive did. So when the bells rang under a black noon, the most important fact may not be that people were frightened. Fear was rational. The more important fact is that they documented enough detail for a serious reconstruction. And yet the reconstruction remained partial, because the evidence was dispersed into letters, memoirs, diaries, legislative anecdotes, local histories, and, later, simplifications. The truth was not hidden behind a locked door. It was hidden in plain sight by the ordinary machinery of record-keeping. The record is still there. The unsettling reframing is this. The dark day of 1780 may not be a story about one unexplained afternoon. It may be a story about how a society encountered a continental environmental event before it possessed the tools to see it whole, then mistook later plausibility for full understanding. Smoke almost certainly mattered. Fire almost certainly mattered. But the experience recorded on the ground suggests a far more intricate atmospheric structure than the summary line usually allowed. A black noon. A dead moon. Ash in the rain. Bells in the daytime. Candles at dinner. A legislature asking whether to adjourn because the sky had become illegible. Those details do not disappear simply because one cause is likely. And that leaves the event where the best hidden histories often end, not in certainty, but in proportion. The question is not whether something supernatural crossed New England. The record does not require that. The question is whether the accepted explanation is broad enough, layered enough, and serious enough to match what witnesses actually described. For more than 2 centuries, the dark day has sat on the edge of weather, history, folklore, and environmental science, never fully belonging to any one of them. The real question is not whether the theory sounds strange, but whether anyone with the tools to verify it has seriously looked.